Hello and welcome to episode number 301 of the Armin Show podcast, where we are learning more, and we're in the 300s now. Different settings for the zeros, the 100s, the 200s, and now it's a new time. And globally, as far as the virus, it's also sort of a new time as well. So there's a bit of a transitionary moment. On this episode here, very fittingly, we have renowned immunologist. Let me give you a great biography, which is something that is informative. John Rhodes, UK-based international expert in immunology and vaccine discovery, has held research fellowships at the US NIH and the University of Cambridge, and from 2001 to 2007, Director of Strategy in Immunology at GlaxoSmithKline. He is the author of the book, How to Make a Vaccine, an essential guide for COVID-19 and beyond. He joins us on this show. Welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be with you tonight.
I'm glad to have you on. I am in Los Angeles. And where are you coming from today?
I'm in East Sussex in the United Kingdom.
The UK is one of, in my view, the hotspots in the earth as far as research and philosophy and a lot of thought. Have you noticed the trend? This is something that's hefty to me. Have you noticed the trend of a lot of thought and research coming from the UK?
Yes, I think the UK has always been strong in scientific research, and one of the measures of this is how many Nobel Prizes are awarded in science. And I think at one point when I was researching this, the USA had the largest number of Nobel Prizes, but the British had the largest number per capita. So while the US, we were the, I guess our contribution per head of scientists was greatest in the world at that particular time.
Is a substantial contribution, and I see it whether it's England or Scotland or
we in science we don't make any difference.
Right. I like that point. We're all working together.
Many of our best engineers are Scottish. If you take engineering, for example, great engineers come from Scotland.
That makes sense. I didn't even think about that. Engineering is valuable as well. Now, from where you are currently, can you take us through how you got to where you are, the steps along the way in your living?
I can indeed, and it'll be a pleasure to do so. In 2013, I published a book called The End of Plagues, the Global Battle Against Infectious Disease. Having been a lifelong research immunologist and vaccinologist, I was moved by the fact that we were very close to eliminating polio on the global scale at that time in 2013. And I wrote the book to coincide with what I thought would be the elimination of polio. Sadly, it wasn't to be. War-torn regions of Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan eluded the attempts of the international strategy to eliminate polio. Since then, cases have bubbled along at about 20 to 30 per year. But we haven't succeeded in eliminating polio. In 2020, Africa became polio-free. Nigeria was the last country in Africa to have polio cases. So that's the background. I was already an established author after a long career in immunology. Britain went into lockdown on March 23rd, 2020. And just a few weeks after that, in mid-April, my literary agent, Peter Tallock, said, if you can write a book on the race for the COVID-19 vaccine, I think we can publish it and it would do well. And so it hadn't occurred to me until then that I could do that. I was working on another project, a book on the history of immunology. And when he said that, I realized, well, of course I could do that. That would be my contribution. So many other people in the healthcare system were making heroic contributions, and I wanted to do something. That's what I decided I could do. And after that, it all went very quickly. The project was accepted by the University of Chicago Press, and I had a great editor in the shape of Joe Calamia. And together, writing a book is a collaborative process. Together we produced How to Make a Vaccine, and we finished the technical editing in September of 2020. So in order for the book to be successful, I had to predict what I thought was going to happen. And I was, right from the outset, very optimistic that we would have a number of successful COVID-19 vaccines. And I thought that RNA and viral vector vaccines, such as the Oxford vaccine, would succeed. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. So in January 2021, I was able to write the epilogue recounting the success, which really surpassed expectation of 4 vaccines in those classes.
Speaking of that, on that point, for the people that are wondering, what types of vaccines came out as the official vaccines that were accepted across UK, United States, and other countries?
Yes, so RNA vaccines are in many ways the most interesting of all, because these vaccines which now have the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which are so very successful, they are the first vaccines of their kind. We've never had vaccines in that class, but they didn't spring out of nowhere. The idea of nucleic acid vaccines, RNA and DNA are members of the nucleic acid family. That type of vaccine was first came into the minds of scientists, US scientists, in 1990. So they've had 30 years of sort of slow maturation. And initially there was a great deal of optimism. That was followed by some disappointment, as the vaccines didn't appear to be effective. And then early in the 20th century, in 2005 in particular, there was a breakthrough in understanding how RNA vaccines could be made to work. And this was work by the American scientists in Philadelphia, and Drew Weissman and his colleagues discovered a way in which we could make RNA vaccines work. And by 2017, both BioNTech, the German company, and Moderna had their RNA vaccines in human trials. They were both for influenza. And BioNTech were also interested in therapeutic vaccines for cancer, for things like prostate cancer and melanoma. And so RNA vaccines were extremely cutting edge, extremely new, but they were already in human clinical trials in 2017. So when the news of the pandemic came in January 2020, the field of RNA vaccination was poised for success. There was plenty of preparation in place. As soon as scientists learned the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, from Wuhan virologists, they were able to plug that into their vaccine technology and very quickly generate their vaccines, which proved so immensely successful in December 2020.
When I liked when you were describing in the book that the things that were already done years ago, immediately it was like plug and play and then go with the new options. If we, obviously this is a hypothetical, but if we removed the last decade of research and we went back to, let's say, 2010, and now we had the same virus show up, how long would the vaccine have taken in comparison, like a estimate?
Yes, I think in 2010, we weren't quite as prepared as we needed to be. So there were refinements to be made. There was preclinical testing in animal models, and then clinical testing to show safety, the all-important factor of safety. And most of that came to maturation in 2017. So we had kind of like 3 years in which anything could happen and we would have been ready. Prior to that, it would have taken a little bit longer. I think it may be maybe 2 to 3 years to do what was achieved in less than a year.
That is a nice thing to hear. I like that when you were describing various conditions in the book, you were talking about how the story progresses and there was this attempt, and then maybe this company had a manufacturing error, and then safety was more of a concern, and the steps along the way. Now we are in May 2021 and have progressed a year from when it started, a year and a little bit more. If immunologists have a main issue now, what would that be that is their biggest concern at this point?
I think that the main issue is the variants of concern, as they're called. So the virus doesn't mutate particularly fast. It mutates. It is mutating, of course, and it's doing so at about half the rate of flu viruses. And we know we can deal with influenza using a sort of yearly update to cover the variations that occurred during the previous year. And we can do the same, I'm sure, with COVID-19. But because the entire world has been subject to very rapid viral transmission throughout every populations in every nation of the world, then the numbers of variants which have arisen have exceeded expectation. And so it's not a massive problem. It's not something we can't surmount. When there's a mutation of concern, it doesn't mean the vaccine is ineffective. It means it's a little bit less effective. And so it will still prevent hospitalization. It will still prevent serious disease. But it won't be as good as it was with the original virus. So we can cope with these. We can make updated vaccines for use probably in the fall of 2021. And these will deal with the major variants that have arisen. And so it's not going to be a problem, but it certainly was somewhat unexpected. The thing about these vaccines is, by their nature, plug and play, they're extremely flexible and quickly adaptable. And that's exactly what we can do to contend with this newly emerging problem.
How broad is it? The spike protein is a big part of what has been targeted, it appears, and the variants have more transmissibility or affect the immune system more in some way. But if the spike protein is what the vaccine is targeting, can the mutations really get around that, or are they limited?
Yes. Yeah. So the spike protein is a little over 1,200 amino acids, and the various variants, mutations that occur, are usually less than a dozen amino acids. So they're relatively small parts of that larger whole. So you can still prevent serious disease, but you can fine tune the next generation of vaccines by using the sequence of those maybe a dozen altered amino acids in the total structure. And so the only variants of concern are the ones usually in the spike protein, but you can make new vaccines to deal with that. The other thing is, this is all based on looking at antibodies. Antibodies are not the only defenders in the immune system. T-cell immunity, cell-mediated immunity, is equally important and can be equally effective against the virus. So saying that we have an evasion of at the level of antibody is not necessarily the problem that you might imagine it is.
Mm-hmm. Another thing on the spike protein, is there nothing else that includes the spike protein that we use biochemically, and only the virus has that type of way to get into cells? Well,
the spike protein targets a molecule on the surface of many kinds of cells. It's called ACE2, and that's an important cell surface structure which is to do with regulating blood pressure. angiotensin converting enzyme is the name of the structure. So it's an important physiological molecule. But the fact that antibodies against it completely prevent the virus from getting into cells makes it, that makes it the target that most people have gone for. Other people, some vaccine producers have gone for a much broader spectrum of antigens in their vaccine. For example, the Chinese have gone for whole killed virus. So that means that all the structures in the virus are generating an immune response in those vaccines, not just the ACE2. So other people have gone for the core of the virus, and there are probably 70 viral vaccines in development for COVID-19, which have yet to hit headlines because they're not in clinical trials. And they're looking at very different strategies, looking at the core, looking at broad specificities. So I think the fact that ACE2 is the focus of that the spike is the focus of most successful vaccines isn't really a weakness in the strategy.
And when vaccines are taken in, are they so separate, the virus and the vaccine interplay, that they have nothing to do with any of our other pathways? Like this happens almost separately, like there's an invader and it's protect, and everything else runs smoothly around?
Well, you normally vaccinate people who don't have the virus. So they've either haven't encountered the virus, or they've recovered from a previous illness with, or perhaps they had asymptomatic COVID-19. In that case, the vaccine can work very well. In people who already had the virus, it'll be like a boosting effect. So that should be that will be very effective. And as to interfering with normal physiological processes, vaccines don't interfere with those processes, so we don't need to be concerned about that. On the other hand, COVID-19 itself, when it's allowed to, when the infection runs its course, it can, in a small proportion of people, cause long-term problems, so-called long COVID. And it's not really, we don't fully understand how that occurs and why that occurs. And there's a great deal of clinical research into how a small minority of individuals suffer long-term problems from COVID-19 infection.
Now, it looks like safety has been pretty well established over a year, and a lot of people have already been vaccinated. At this point, now that so many have been vaccinated, what safety concerns come to mind? Is there any like big data that is able to be accumulated to map forward?
Yes, well, I think the clotting problem has been the major concern for those monitoring vaccine safety. And there's no doubt that clotting is occurring in a tiny proportion of individuals who've received the vaccine. There hasn't been a formal proof that the vaccine is causing these problems, but it does seem quite likely that it is. These are the viral vector vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And the number of cases is very, very low. It's about, at worst, rather, 500,000 individuals, 1 in 500,000 individuals receiving the vaccine may have these clotting complications. So the benefit of the vaccines hugely outweighs the risks. But clinical research, intensive clinical research, is ongoing to try and understand how this clotting phenomenon is occurring.
When the vaccines are coming out and there's many different ones, you talk about evaluating the contenders. What's a key point that separates them? Is it just safety, or if one stands out as super effective and is slightly not as safe, it'll still be award winning? Like, how does that get ranked?
Yes, so there is a balance to be struck between safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine. And happily, it's not something we've had to compromise on. I mean, the most successful vaccines, the RNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer, seem to be extremely safe. The viral vector vaccines, they're easier to distribute. They don't need storage at very low temperatures, and they're cheaper they're cheaper. So that they really were the workhorse candidates for global distribution. And so that's why it was disappointing to see the safety concerns arising. But I don't think it's going to prevent the low and middle income nations from benefiting from the viral vector vaccines. And in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's a single shot vaccine. That's also hugely useful in areas where you may have hard to reach populations, where health infrastructure may not be as good as in the developed nations. The other thing is, when we've got, there will be other second generation vaccines which are given orally and perhaps nasally, which will have a great ease of use advantage, and that will be another factor in what in the longer term is adopted in the global fight against COVID-19.
I didn't think about that. That's a good point about the single shot being valuable, where one place they can only guarantee that somebody will get one shot and then they might go somewhere else. Interesting. One question that came to mind is coronaviruses were sort of predicted and seen over time to come up, and there are other potential ones in the background that could transfer zoonotically. Do they all involve like a spike protein, or what other category of viruses should we be concerned about that these vaccines don't cover?
Well, I think in the case of Ebola, which was in 2014, we had the most serious Ebola epidemic we've ever had. That had a very similar cell surface protein which latched onto a particular component of human cells, very similar to the spike protein. And Merck developed a vaccine. It took 5 years and more for that vaccine to reach the clinic, and it's just in 2020 was licensed for use in West Africa, and it's more than 80% effective against Ebola. So I think that that was a very good learning ground for what we would have to contend with COVID-19. I think it's the problem with emergent diseases, by definition, is we don't know what they're going to be. In the beginning of the 21st century, we had SARS, and then in 2020 we had SARS-CoV-2. The COVID-19 epidemic is a development from the original SARS epidemic of the beginning of the 21st century. But with the exploitation of increasing exploitation of the natural environments by human incursion, it's inevitable that we'll come across new viruses, zoonotic viruses confined to animals in the past, which are now ripe to become the emergent infections of the future. But the good news is we will have all these tools, all these vaccine technologies, all these platforms into which we can plug the new components of whatever virus is the next to hit us in the decades ahead.
Now, in some countries, such as the United States or the United Kingdom, the virus has more or less come and diminished. And then in some other countries, it's somewhat flattened out. And then we have our example of India at this time that is zooming up in numbers. Other than, obviously, India has a shock factor to it as far as it happening. But for future countries, will they have readily available solutions if there's some sort of spring up that the best vaccines can be sent there and target that group?
Yes, well, I think it's ironic that India is having such a very difficult time at present, because they're one of the important manufacturers of COVID-19 vaccines. The State Serum Institute of India produces large amounts of the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, and they also have their own vaccines, which their own scientists have discovered and are developing. The problem in India was the vaccine rollout was rather slow, and they relaxed the sort of lockdown kinds of measures. And because in that culture, gatherings are so very important to religious life and spiritual life, I think that's contributed to the terrible situation that they currently face. The other thing is, we have to remember that India has a population of more than 1.3 billion people. You know, the US has a little over 300 million. The UK has a little under 70 million people. 1.3 billion people. You know, it's very difficult to orchestrate an effective response to a virus which is running wild. The world is responding. The world is sending aid. The world is sending oxygen, and there are organizations such as COVAX who are very, very keen to try to send vaccines to those in most need. But it will take time, and I'm afraid that it will be a while before India gets on top of the surge in the COVID-19 cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think about future countries like, let's say, Venezuela or some various country that are small. And then if now we have all the data and we have the vaccines and other countries taken care of, then if there's some sort of rise, then they can send supplies and target.
Yes, I think that's a good point. There is a policy to donate excess vaccines. I mean, I think most public health experts believe that global, that servicing low and middle income countries with vaccines would have to wait until the developed nations had satisfied the needs of their own populations. It doesn't sound ethical, but it just is a fact of life. That's what's going to happen. But as soon as countries begin to get on top of it, like the USA, the UK, and Europe, then they are committed to distributing their excess vaccines. And organizations such as COVAX, which works with the WHO and Gavi and UNESCO, their sole purpose in life is to ensure equitable distribution of vaccines to nations in need. It's just that they have to wait until the developed nations have satisfied the needs of their own population. It's already beginning to happen, and commitments are already there on paper, but it will take a while. And I take your point about small Latin American countries and the difficulties they're facing. Very difficult at the present time.
Right. It's nice when one group already has things managed and then is able to reach back and assist some others. That's a cool feature. Now, in every category, there are people that are the forerunners in that category. Obviously, there's historical individuals that are the people that try things, which is the important thing in life, just trying things, figuring it out. In the current moment, are there any immunologists or epidemiologists that you look to, or that seem to be like the philosopher of that category?
Well, I think the heroic figures of COVID race for the COVID-19 vaccine have been, for example, the Turkish founders of the BioNTech company, who were quietly working away on vaccines for cancer therapy, and influenza. They were first-generation immigrants from Turkey to Germany, and they founded BioNTech as a cancer therapy company. And at the beginning of 2020, they made this most important business decision to commit to COVID-19 vaccination. So they're academics, they're ordinary, hardworking scientists, and yet they've completely turned the tide of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think people like them have been extremely important. The same is true in the case of Moderna, where the scientists who pioneered RNA vaccination, they couldn't know that it was going to be so successful, but nevertheless they committed themselves to bringing it to fruition. And lastly, the Oxford scientists, they were very much preparing for what they call disease X, the next pandemic that would come out of nowhere. They were there for the SARS epidemic. They were there for the MERS, Middle East respiratory virus epidemic, and that they produced the platforms which they could then rapidly switch to COVID-19 when the need arose. And so their policy was one of vigilance. What is this emerging virus going to be important? If so, we need to spring into action immediately. And that's exactly what they did.
It's a wonderful thing. One thing that I thought of while you were describing that is a lot of it is preparation and using past research. Is there any element of small amounts of luck in the past year anywhere in the attempts, or is there not really room for that?
Well, I think there has been luck, and for decades we were struggling with DNA vaccines, in particular nucleic acid vaccines as a class, trying to increase their potency. And then in around 2005, there was a breakthrough in understanding how to make RNA look more like human RNA. So the RNA from a virus is a danger signal for the immune system. The immune system goes into overdrive when it sees it, eliminates it too early before the vaccine can do its job. And so groups such as Drew Weissman's lab in Philadelphia showed us how we could modify RNA to make it look more like human RNA, and then it could be used as a vaccine. So I think that was an important breakthrough, and there was a certain amount of luck in discovering why it was that we were having so much trouble with RNA vaccines. And then in 2012, I think it was, people discovered how to protect RNA vaccines using these lipid parcels, these fatty envelopes, which would give them a sufficient lifetime in the body to be taken up by cells and do their jobs as potent vaccines. So that was another important component. But I think there's less, rather than lucky breaks, most of this has been a sort of gradual progression, building on knowledge. And as I said earlier, the fact that we were at this state of preparedness when the COVID-19 pandemic broke.
That's a cool feature. When you were describing that, I like that if it was too quickly attacked, then it doesn't work. And if it's too long, you described it in the book. I like that the natural filter of when there's like a young person, if their immune system immediately fights off items that are like itself, to get rid of or removes any attacking of one's own cells. And then there was a two-sided filter. Can you describe that?
Yes, I can. So there are two major components to the immune system, and one is called the innate immune system. And it evolved very early in the evolution of life. And it's a simpler, more fundamental system, which eliminates infectious threats very quickly. Later, about around the time that the bony fishes evolved, the adaptive immune system evolved, and that's much more intelligent, much more specific, and that's what we're aiming for. It's adaptive, so once it learns the shape of pathogens and it remembers them. And so that's what vaccines exploit. So if the innate immune system, which just eliminates incoming infections, works too quickly, then the adaptive, intelligent immune system doesn't get the chance to learn and remember the infection.
I think it's super cool. It's like evolution inside of oneself early on.
Yes, indeed. It's all still there.
Right?
Yeah.
That keeps us, even in 2021, having a healthy response, kind of like we did in 1400 or 800 or whenever.
Indeed.
It's kind of cool. I guess it had to be in there that way, or else we would have broken down at some point. These kinds of things need to be there in some way.
Yes.
It's kind of a cool feature. One thing I always like to check in a broader nature, if you had a message to all people of the planet regarding either immunology or the current state of the globe, what might you tell all people?
Well, I think the first thing I would tell it, I would want to assure them that vaccines are safe. And it's very understandable that there is a degree of vaccine hesitancy because people don't understand how these vaccines were developed so quickly for COVID-19. But the fact is, it is because of what we've been talking about, the fact that the technologies were already there, already proven to be safe. You just had to add that extra element, the cassette, for the COVID-19 vaccine. So I would urge people to seek vaccination and to accept vaccination, because they're protecting themselves and they're protecting those around them. And another thing I would say is, nobody wins this battle against the virus until everybody wins, because we've seen how problems in South America or in Asia can lead to new mutants, to new variants, which can trouble the whole world. And so we need to understand that the global collaborative effort to beat this virus is of supreme importance, and we should all contribute to it as much as we can. And we should all understand the importance of international collaboration and helping those countries who are in most need, because we also benefit when that happens.
We're all part of one whole thing.
Indeed, very much so in the case of a pandemic.
Right. Renowned immunologist John Rhodes, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode of the show. Your book, How to Make a Vaccine, is available for the people, and thank you for the knowledge you have provided to all of us.
Armin, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
This is great, and we are out.